Grief doesn't always come from death. Sometimes, it's from realizing your own parents never saw you as enough. My name is Henry, and 2 years ago, I found out my parents gave my brother $150,000 to buy his dream house while telling me I was the failure. I didn't yell, didn't fight. I just disappeared. But when my brother accidentally drove past my property 2 years later, he called our dad screaming, "You need to see this right now." Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today? Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss more real-life stories like this one. Because trust me, this one changes everything. My name is Henry Miller, and I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows what kind of car you drive, how much you make, and who your parents are. I'm 35 now, work as an HVAC technician, and I've always been the kind of man who believes in fixing things with my hands. But some things, like family, can't be fixed with a wrench and duct tape. When I was a kid, my parents had a simple formula for love. Praise Tom, question Henry. Tom, my younger brother, was the golden child, the one with the easy smile, the good hair, and the grades that never dropped below an A-. Me? I was the quiet one. I worked part-time at the grocery store in high school, helped Dad patch the roof, and took care of the lawn every weekend. But no matter what I did, I always heard the same sentence, sometimes said softly, sometimes with that sting only a parent's voice can carry. Why can't you be more like Tom? When Tom got his driver's license at 16, Dad handed him the keys to a used Honda Civic, a congratulations gift. When I turned 16, Dad handed me a mower and said, "You can earn your own wheels if you work hard enough." I did. I saved up for a rusty Ford pickup, but I remember how Mom looked at it like I'd parked an embarrassment in the driveway. They smiled for Tom's every step. They frowned at mine. When it came to college, the pattern deepened. Mom and Dad paid Tom's full tuition at Ohio State. I wanted to go to trade school for heating and air systems, a field that could get me working quickly, but they told me, that's not a real career. So, I took out loans, worked double shifts, and paid my way. When I graduated, they didn't even come to the ceremony. Their excuse? Your brother's graduation party was that weekend. You understand. Oh, I understood. All right. I understood that love in our family came with terms and conditions. It wasn't just money. It was attention, affection, validation. When Tom got engaged, Mom couldn't stop crying tears of joy. When I told them about my girlfriend at the time, Dad said, "You sure she's not just after someone to fix her air conditioner?" They laughed at their own joke. I did too, but later that night, I sat in my car and gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Still, I kept trying. I'd show up for family dinners, bring homemade food, and ask about their week. They'd answer politely, then steer the conversation toward Tom, his promotions, his vacations, his new car. Once, I told Dad I'd gotten a raise at work. He said, "That's nice. Did you hear Tom's company gave him a bonus?" That's when I stopped trying to compete. By my early 30s, I had accepted my role as the responsible disappointment. I wasn't the troublemaker, but somehow, I was always the one who'd let them down. They said I didn't visit enough. They said I didn't share enough. They said I never reached out. And yet, when I did, I felt invisible in my own family. One memory still burns in my mind. It was Thanksgiving, a few years before everything exploded. Tom showed up late, drunk, and knocked over Mom's crystal vase. She laughed it off. "Oh, honey, that thing's old anyway." Later that night, I accidentally dropped a plate while cleaning. Dad barked, "You've got to be more careful, Henry." That's when I realized it didn't matter what I did. I was always wrong. I remember lying awake that night, hearing their laughter in the other room while I tried to drown out the sound with a pillow. I told myself, one day, you'll stop needing their approval. One day, you'll be free. But freedom didn't come easily. Even as an adult, I carried that need for validation like a scar that wouldn't fade. I wanted them to be proud. I wanted to prove I was worth something. And that desire, that quiet, painful hope, was exactly what made what happened next hurt so much more. Because when I found out how far they'd go to show me where I stood in their eyes, it wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal and the death of any illusion that family meant fairness. And that moment, that revelation, started on an ordinary Sunday, over a plate of cold lasagna and fake smiles. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, 2 years before everything changed. I was driving down to my parents' house. A trip I made out of obligation more than desire. I had just finished an HVAC installation job and still had grease on my hands, but Mom insisted I come for dinner. Tom and his family will be there, she'd said, her voice cheerful. It's been too long since all of us sat together. I remember thinking, maybe this time it'll feel different. Maybe Mom would ask how my work was going. Maybe Dad would tell me he was proud I'd built my own small contracting business from scratch. But deep down, I already knew better. When I arrived, Tom's car, a brand new black SUV, was gleaming in the driveway. His wife, Melissa, waved from the porch, holding their toddler. Tom came out grinning, wearing a crisp polo and expensive watch. I gave him a handshake that turned into a brief hug. Hey man, I said. Nice ride. No. He smirked. Yeah, part of the package. I didn't ask what he meant. I should have known that cryptic smile of his always came with some kind of show-off punchline. Inside, the table was already set. Mom fussed over Tom's kid, cooing like she hadn't done for any child since Tom was born. Dad poured him a glass of his favorite bourbon, the expensive kind he only brought out for special guests. I got a beer from the fridge myself. Dinner started as it always did. Small talk about work, about the weather, about neighbors I didn't care to remember. Tom was talking about moving up in the world. He'd been renting a nice townhouse, but now, apparently, he had something bigger coming. Then he dropped it. We closed on the house last week, he said proudly, wiping his mouth with a napkin. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a backyard, and a garage that actually fits my truck. Mom clapped her hands like he'd just announced a royal wedding. Oh, sweetheart, we're so proud of you. All those years of hard work paying off. I smiled politely. That's awesome, Tom. Congrats, man. He grinned back. Thanks. Bro couldn't have done it without Mom and Dad. I thought I misheard him. What do you mean? He leaned back, satisfied with the effect. They helped with the down payment. 150 grand. Couldn't have afforded it otherwise. The room went silent, but not for long, because I stopped breathing for a moment. $150,000. I turned to my parents. Dad was still cutting his steak like nothing happened. Mom smiled gently and said, Tom needed a good start, honey. You've always been the independent one. That word, independent, hit harder than any insult. It was their favorite excuse, their shield. When they didn't want to help me, they called me independent. When they wanted to spoil Tom, they called him in need. I felt my throat tighten. You gave him $150,000. Mom's tone shifted, defensive, almost impatient. Henry, don't make a scene. You've always been so self-sufficient. We figured you'd want to stand on your own 2 feet. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. I took out $30,000 in student loans for trade school. You said you couldn't spare a dime. Dad didn't look up. You chose trade school. Tom went the traditional route. You can't compare the two. The words sank in like stones. In their eyes, I'd never made the right choices, just the convenient ones that made their favorite son look better. I wanted to leave right then, but something in me, pride, maybe, made me stay until dessert. Mom brought out her famous pecan pie, the one she always made for Tom's birthdays. She served everyone a slice. She didn't ask if I wanted any. While Tom bragged about floor plans and mortgage rates, I just stared at my empty plate, the fork heavy in my hand. In my head, I replayed every moment I'd worked overtime, skipped vacations, and eaten instant noodles just to stay afloat. And all along, they'd been handing out checks behind closed doors, checks I never even knew existed. When it was finally time to go, Mom hugged me lightly and said, Don't be jealous, honey. One day, your turn will come. My turn. As if love and fairness were a waiting list, and I just hadn't earned my number yet. In the car, I sat for a while before starting the engine. The streetlights cast long shadows across the dashboard. I thought about calling her out, about yelling, about finally saying what had been boiling inside me for years. But instead, I whispered, You'll never get it. None of you will. That night, I drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the road and the faint echo of my parents' laughter still ringing in my head. When I got home, I sat on my porch, staring at the stars, and I made a quiet promise to myself, not out of anger, but out of clarity. You don't owe them any more explanations, Henry. You've done enough. You've given enough. That was the last time I called my parents for a long, long time. Because that dinner didn't just end a meal. It ended the version of me that still believed family meant equality. And from that night forward, I stopped chasing love that needed proof of worth. I stopped calling home. And for the first time in my life, I began to understand what peace, painful, lonely peace, could actually feel like. After that dinner, I didn't call. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not for Christmas, New Year's, or my birthday. I didn't send texts or answer theirs. And when Mom left me a voicemail saying, "Henry, we're worried you're upset," I deleted it without listening to the rest. For 33 years, I had been the one who showed up at birthdays, holidays, family emergencies. Even when they forgot mine, I still came. Even when they talked over me at the dinner table, I still smiled. But that night, something inside me finally went still. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness. It was clarity. I had spent my entire life trying to prove I was worth loving, and all it ever got me was exhaustion. So I chose silence. At first, it felt like guilt. I'd catch myself reaching for the phone, ready to check in, just like old habits. Then I'd stop. I told myself, they didn't call you to ask how you were. They only called to remind you that you weren't him. A few weeks later, Dad sent me a short message. "We're family no matter what. Don't let jealousy ruin that." I stared at those words, the gall of them. How easily they flipped the narrative. How quickly my pain became jealousy. I didn't reply. Instead, I started focusing on something I'd always pushed aside, myself. My business had been steady, but I'd never really invested in growing it. Now, I poured everything into it. I picked up weekend calls, offered maintenance plans, and took side jobs that most guys turned down. Work became my therapy. When my hands were busy, my mind was quiet. During long nights fixing boilers in empty basements, I thought about everything I'd lost and realized maybe I hadn't lost much at all. Family, I decided, wasn't supposed to make you feel smaller. If it did, it wasn't family. It was an audience waiting for you to fail. I started saving aggressively. No vacations. No restaurants. No impulse buys. Every dollar I earned went into a high-yield account. At first, I didn't even know what I was saving for. I just knew I needed a goal that was mine alone. My apartment was small but cozy. The kind of place most people would overlook. But it was mine, paid with sweat and late nights. Every corner of it reminded me of something I'd fixed or built myself. The squeaky door, the patched drywall, the old HVAC unit that ran like new because I made it that way. Funny thing, once I stopped chasing validation, life got quieter, but also simpler. I'd come home, cook dinner for one, watch the sun set from my balcony, and feel something new, peace. But peace has a strange side effect. When you've lived your whole life under someone else's shadow, silence feels like guilt. You start wondering if you're wrong for wanting distance. You start asking if maybe you're overreacting. For months, that thought haunted me. But every time I almost picked up the phone, I remembered Mom's voice that night. "You've always been the independent one." Not said with pride, said with dismissal. That was all the reminder I needed. One evening, I ran into Bill, a retired contractor who lived down the street. He was in his late 60s, the kind of guy who smelled like sawdust and coffee. We got to talking about work, about tools, about the cost of living. Before long, we started teaming up on weekend repair projects. Bill had this way of teaching without condescension, something I hadn't experienced since childhood. He respected me. That alone was enough to keep me showing up at his workshop every Saturday morning. Over time, he became more than a mentor. He became a friend, the kind you actually look forward to hearing from. We'd fix old cabins, swap stories, and sometimes just sit with the radio on, not saying a word. One afternoon, while we were repairing an old fence, Bill said, "You ever think about buying land, Henry? Something small, something that's yours." The thought hit me harder than I expected. No, I hadn't. I'd been too busy surviving to imagine owning anything more than my tiny apartment. But that question lingered in my head for days afterward. That night, I opened my laptop and started browsing foreclosures, just out of curiosity. Most listings were way out of reach, but one caught my eye. A 5-acre lot with a rundown workshop and a half-burned cabin. It looked awful. Roof caved in, siding falling apart, overgrown weeds everywhere. But it was cheap, ridiculously cheap, because no one wanted to deal with it. I called Bill the next morning and said, "You want to take a drive?" He laughed. "Now you're talking." That drive turned out to be the start of everything. A beginning disguised as an ending. Because while my parents were busy funding my brother's dream life, I was about to build something from ashes, literally. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone's permission. Not their approval, not their blessing, not their money. Just my hands, my will, and a patch of forgotten land that no one believed in. Exactly like me. The first time I saw the property, I almost turned back. It sat at the end of a gravel road about an hour outside of town, surrounded by fields and overgrown brush. The driveway was more mud than gravel. The air smelled like wet leaves and old timber. The workshop stood crooked, its tin roof half collapsed. The remains of a burned-down cabin sat behind it, blackened beams sticking up like broken ribs. Bill stepped out of his truck, hands on his hips, and whistled low. "Well, Henry," he said, "she's ugly. But she's got bones." That made me laugh for the first time in weeks. The property cost next to nothing because no one wanted to take on the mess. But to me, it wasn't a mess. It was a blank slate, something I could make my own, piece by piece. I called the bank that same week. They said if I put 20% down, they'd approve the loan. I didn't even hesitate. All those months of saving, every dollar I'd squirreled away while my family ignored me, it finally had a purpose. The paperwork went through faster than I expected. When the sale closed, I stood in that empty workshop with the key in my hand. There wasn't much to look at: cracked concrete floor, rusted tools left behind, walls covered in graffiti, but it was mine. And that meant more than anything my parents had ever given me. The first few weeks were brutal. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no insulation. Every morning before work, I'd drive out there with my toolbox and spend hours clearing debris, chopping weeds, and patching holes in the roof. At night, I'd eat dinner sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the sunset through the open frame of what used to be a window. Some people might have seen it as lonely. I didn't. After years of begging for acknowledgement, the quiet felt like peace. I could finally hear myself think. Bill started showing up on weekends. He'd bring coffee, sandwiches, and a trunk full of old tools. We worked side by side, talking about everything and nothing. He'd tell stories about his late wife, his years in construction, the jobs he regretted taking, and the ones he was proud of. Sometimes he'd glance at me and say, "You've got the heart for this, kid. Most people quit before it gets good." I didn't know what good meant at the time, but I was determined to find out. I started learning everything: carpentry, wiring, plumbing, roofing. YouTube became my night school, and the workshop became my test lab. When mistakes happened, and there were many, Bill would just grin and say, "Now you'll never forget how to do it right." By late spring, the workshop was finally safe enough to stay in overnight. I bought a used cot, a propane heater, and a camping stove. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. I remember the first night I slept there. No TV, no phone calls, just the sound of crickets outside and the wind pushing through the broken windows. It wasn't comfort, but it was mine. The days turned into a rhythm. Work my HVAC jobs during the week, fix the property on weekends. Every board I nailed down, every leak I patched, it felt like I was rebuilding something inside me too. People in town started noticing. A few neighbors stopped by, curious about the guy working alone on the ghost property. When they found out I was doing it myself, word spread fast. Soon, I started getting calls from locals asking if I could fix small things: heaters, ducts, old wiring. That side work turned into steady income. One evening, after a long day of sanding floors, Bill said, "You ever think this is more than a project? Maybe it's a fresh start?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked around. The newly framed walls, the smell of sawdust, the faint sound of frogs by the creek. He was right. This wasn't just a project. It was proof. Proof that I didn't need handouts. Proof that the failure could build something lasting. By midsummer, I had installed solar panels, secondhand ones I bought off a guy online. I wired them myself after a week of reading manuals. When the lights finally came on for the first time, I stood there with tears in my eyes. It wasn't about the electricity. It was about power, the kind that comes from doing something no one thought you could. With Bill's help, I turned the old workshop into a proper home. One big open room, with a sleeping loft, a small kitchen, and a corner office for paperwork. It wasn't fancy, but it had warmth. Character. Every imperfection told a story. And the best part? No one could take it from me. I didn't tell my parents. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't owe them the satisfaction of seeing what I'd built without them. Besides, silence had become my new comfort. In the evenings, I'd sit outside with a beer and watch the sunset over the trees. Sometimes, I'd think about Tom, his big house, his perfect family, his perfect life. I wondered if he ever looked around and felt proud of himself, or if deep down, he knew everything he had was borrowed. Me? Mine was earned. Every bruise, every splinter, every drop of sweat, all earned. That realization changed something in me. I stopped feeling bitter. I stopped caring about who got more. Because finally, I had enough. And in that enoughness, I found something my brother and parents never would. Peace built from effort, not entitlement. What I didn't know then was that this peace, this little life I was building, was about to be interrupted in the most unexpected way. All it would take was one drive-by, one curious glance through a car window, and suddenly, my silence would start making a lot of noise. A year after buying the land, I barely recognized it. What once looked like a forgotten junkyard was turning into something almost serene. The overgrown fields were now trimmed pastures. The crooked fence posts I'd salvaged from a demolition site stood in neat lines. The burned-down cabin was rebuilt, not big, but strong, clean, and designed with care. Every beam, every nail had my fingerprints on it. When I'd first told Bill I wanted to rebuild the cabin, he laughed. "Kid, you're crazy," he said. "You could buy a pre-built one and save yourself 6 months." But I just grinned. "That's the point," I said. "I want to build something that lasts because I built it." So I did. Every weekend became a marathon. I'd wake up before sunrise, put on my work boots, and head straight out to the property. The mornings were quiet, just me and the sound of saws, hammers, and the occasional hawk crying from the tree-line. I learned to pour concrete, to set trusses, to run plumbing lines without flooding the floor. YouTube tutorials became my college degree. Bill's old pickup became my supply truck. And little by little, that pile of lumber turned into a home. When the walls went up, I stood inside the frame and felt this wild mix of exhaustion and pride. It wasn't just wood and nails, it was proof that I could stand on my own 2 feet. By the time fall came, I had a cabin with real walls, a solid roof, working lights, and a front porch that faced the sunset. I stained the wood deep amber and added window boxes with flowers. It looked simple, but it had soul. I planted trees along the driveway, maple, oak, a couple of cherry trees for spring blooms. I even dug a small pond near the edge of the property, lined it with rocks, and stocked it with koi I bought from a farm supply store. Bill came by one afternoon, parked his truck, and just stared for a minute. "Damn, Henry," he said quietly. "You turned nothing into something. You realize that?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," I said, "but it's more than that. I turned pain into peace." He smiled in that proud, fatherly way I hadn't seen from anyone in years. "That's worth more than $150,000, he said. And I believed him. By the second year, the transformation was undeniable. The cabin gleamed in the sunlight, the pond reflected the sky, and the workshop had been converted into a small studio. I started renting it out to travelers, weekenders looking for quiet. It didn't bring in much, but it covered the mortgage and gave me freedom to keep expanding. I also built a greenhouse, a modest one at first, but later I added automatic vents, a rainwater system, and solar-powered lights. I grew vegetables, herbs, and flowers. People from town started dropping by to buy fresh produce. They called it Henry's Garden Retreat. And just like that, what started as a broken property became a sanctuary. I wasn't rich, but for the first time in my life, I felt wealthy. Wealthy in time, purpose, and peace. Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from my family in nearly 2 years. Not a call, not a message, not even a birthday text. Sometimes I wondered if they even remembered I existed. Then again, maybe that silence was what allowed me to grow. But fate, or irony, wasn't done with me yet. Because all it took to bring the past crashing back into my life was a single car on a Sunday afternoon. It was a warm day in early summer. I was sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the koi ripple the pond water. That's when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A silver SUV slowed down at the edge of my driveway. At first, I thought it was a lost tourist. But then I recognized the license plate frame. Proud dad of a baseball star. Tom's car. My chest tightened. What the hell was he doing here? He didn't stop completely. Just rolled past slowly, eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. He looked like someone who'd just seen a ghost. I didn't move, didn't wave, just watched him drive by, his head craning to take in the pond, the cabin, the greenhouse, the workshop, all of it. He disappeared down the road, and I exhaled slowly. A strange mix of amusement and relief filled me. Let him wonder. But about 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A number I hadn't seen in 2 years, my father's. I didn't answer. Then it buzzed again. This time, a voicemail. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed play. It was Tom. His voice was panicked, loud, breathless. Dad, you need to see this. You need to come out here. Henry's place. It's insane. You won't believe it. He's living like some millionaire in the woods. How the hell did he do this? I froze. A slow smile crept across my face. Not out of spite, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone's validation. Not even theirs. The silence I'd chosen for 2 years had finally spoken for me, louder than words ever could. And yet, that phone call, that single moment, would set off a chain of events that would test everything I'd built, not just the home, but the peace I'd fought so hard to earn. Because some people can't stand watching you rise higher than the box they put you in. And my parents were about to prove that, the hard way. I should have known that Tom wouldn't keep quiet. The voicemail said it all. He was stunned, jealous, and furious. But I didn't expect what came next. 3 days later, I was out back splitting firewood when I heard 2 cars coming down the gravel road. The sound made my stomach sink, that slow, deliberate crunch of tires I hadn't heard since childhood. I turned around just in time to see them pull up. One was Tom's silver SUV. The other, a black sedan I'd recognize anywhere, my father's. For a moment, I just stood there, axe in hand, sweat dripping down my neck. It felt like time had folded in on itself. 2 years of silence, erased in the sound of car doors slamming. Tom was the first to speak. So it's true, he said, eyes scanning the cabin, the pond, the greenhouse. You really did all this? I wiped my hands on my jeans. Yeah, I said quietly. With my own 2 hands. Dad stepped out of the car slowly. His expression was complicated. Half shock, half disbelief. He looked older, grayer, thinner, but his tone was the same cold steel I remembered. You built this? He asked. Every inch, I said. He looked around again, frowning. How? That word, how, stung more than I expected. Not why, not for what purpose, just how. As if my success was some kind of trick. I shrugged. Hard work. Time. Learning. Things you said I'd never have. Tom scoffed. Come on, Henry. You expect us to believe you did all this on your own? This place looks like a damn magazine spread. Bill's old truck was parked near the greenhouse. He must have heard the noise because the door creaked open, and he stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He's not lying, Bill said. Kid built this from the ground up. I just lent a few tools and some advice. Tom turned toward him. And who the hell are you? Bill's lips twitched. Someone who believes in him. Dad frowned deeper. We didn't come here to argue, he said finally. We came because your brother said, well, that you've been hiding something. That you're sitting on property that's... He hesitated. Worth quite a bit. There it was. Not pride. Not admiration. Just value. I let out a slow, bitter laugh. So that's why you're here. You think I struck gold or something? Mom's voice cut through before I even noticed she'd stepped out of the car. I hadn't seen her face since the day she called me a failure. Now, she looked like she was holding back tears, but I wasn't sure if they were real or for show. Henry, she said softly, we just want to understand. You disappeared. You didn't call, didn't write. Then we hear you've been living like this, out here, all alone. All alone. I repeated. You make it sound like I vanished on accident. I stopped calling because you made it clear I wasn't wanted. Dad's jaw tightened. That's not fair, he snapped. We just wanted what was best for both our sons. No, I said sharply. You wanted what was convenient. You gave Tom $150,000 and called me a disappointment. That's not what's best. That's favoritism dressed up as love. Tom's face turned red. You don't get it, Henry. I needed that money. I had a wife, a kid. I cut him off. And I had potential. But you all decided it wasn't worth investing in. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, the silence stretching like a rubber band about to snap. Then Dad's voice dropped, calm but sharp. We thought you'd never make anything of yourself. That sentence landed like a punch to the gut. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I'd always known. I looked around, at the cabin, the pond, the greenhouse glowing in the sunlight, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Then look around, I said. This is what failure looks like. Tom shook his head, pacing. You don't understand how hard it's been for us. The house is falling apart. The bills keep stacking up. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the house they bought for you? That shut him up. Then Mom stepped closer, lowering her voice like she always did when she wanted to sound gentle. Henry, honey, you've clearly done well for yourself. Maybe it's time you come home. Reconnect. We could rebuild the family, you know? It was almost laughable. 2 years of silence, and suddenly, now that I had something worth seeing, they wanted family. I shook my head slowly. Home? This is home. I built it without you. I don't need to go back to a place where love has a price tag. Bill crossed his arms, watching quietly from the side. Dad's face darkened. You're being ungrateful, he said. We gave you life. We gave you opportunity. I met his eyes. No, you gave him opportunity. You gave me a lesson that sometimes you have to be your own family. The silence that followed was the most powerful thing I'd ever heard. Tom's voice cracked slightly. You think you're better than us now? I smiled faintly. No, I just think I'm finally me. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Dad muttered something under his breath, turned toward the car, and got in without another word. Mom followed, quietly crying. Tom lingered a second longer, looking back at the cabin, the pond, the life I'd built. He whispered, almost to himself, How did you do it? I didn't answer. I just looked him in the eye and said, The hard way, the honest way. Then I turned back toward my workshop, picked up my tools, and went back to work. As their cars disappeared down the road, I felt a strange peace. Not triumph, not revenge, just closure. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval. And maybe for the first time, they realized they couldn't buy it. That night, after my family's cars disappeared down the road, I sat on the porch in silence. The sun was dipping low, painting the pond in gold and orange. The crickets had started their evening chorus, and the smell of sawdust still lingered in the air. I thought I'd feel anger, or maybe some kind of hollow satisfaction. But what I felt was peace. For so long, I'd chased their approval like it was oxygen, begging, explaining, defending myself. And now, finally, I didn't need to. They'd seen the proof with their own eyes. Not that I was successful, but that I was whole. That's a different kind of wealth. Later that week, Bill stopped by with a six-pack. He handed me one, sat down beside me, and nodded toward the empty road. They came, huh? I chuckled. Yeah, made quite an entrance. How'd it go? I took a sip, thinking. Like I expected. Shock, confusion, a little guilt, a lot of pride. He nodded. Families have a way of showing up when you've already done the hard part. We sat there for a while, listening to the frogs by the pond. I told him how my mom tried to get me to come home. He laughed softly. You already are home, son. Those words hit deep. Because it was true. This place, the walls, the trees, the soil beneath my boots, was more home than any house I'd ever lived in with them. Every inch of it carried my effort, my mistakes, and my growth. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal. I worked, I tended the garden, I kept improving the cabin. The greenhouse flourished. My small rental studio became so popular that I started booking guests months in advance. I even began teaching local kids a few basic carpentry skills on weekends. Funny how the world opens up when you stop waiting for permission to live. I hadn't planned on hearing from my family again. But about a month later, a letter came in the mail from my mom. The handwriting was neat, familiar, and trembling. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. She wrote that she'd been wrong, not just about the money, but about me. That she realized how much she'd let favoritism blind her. And that maybe, someday, if I was open to it, she'd like to visit. I read it 3 times. Part of me wanted to call her right then. But another part of me, the quieter, wiser part, knew I wasn't ready. Forgiveness isn't instant. It's built like anything else worth keeping, slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. So I didn't call. Not yet. Instead, I wrote back a short note. I'm glad you reached out. I'm okay. I hope you are too. And that was enough for now. A few months later, Tom sent a text, just one line. You were right. About everything. No explanation. No apology. Just that. But it was more than I ever thought I'd get. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if they'd treated me equally. If I'd gotten that $150,000 head start. Maybe I'd have bought a house in the suburbs like Tom. Maybe I'd be comfortable, but empty. Because, truthfully, this struggle shaped me. The rejection, the silence, the loneliness, all of it became fuel. Without it, I wouldn't have learned the value of work, patience, and quiet pride. I used to think success meant proving them wrong. Now I know it just means proving myself right. One evening, months later, I stood by the pond, watching the koi dance beneath the surface. The sky turned pink, and for a brief moment, I felt something close to gratitude, even for the pain. Because pain, when you face it instead of running from it, becomes purpose. I thought about my dad, his stubborn pride, his cold tone, and I realized something that surprised me. He was a prisoner of his own idea of success. He measured love by achievement, worth by numbers, and pride by comparison. And I had finally broken free of that. Maybe that's why he couldn't look me in the eye when he left. Because deep down, he knew I'd built something stronger than he ever could. Not just a home, but a life built on self-respect. And that's something no one can hand you. You have to earn it. As I headed inside, I glanced at the front door, solid oak, sanded smooth, sealed by hand. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. Because I made it myself. And every time I walk through it, I remember. Sometimes being the failure is the best thing that ever happens to you. Because it forces you to stop living for approval and start living for yourself. So, if you're watching this right now and you've ever been told you'll never amount to anything, if you've ever been the lesser one, the forgotten one, I want you to remember something. You're not behind. You're just building differently. Your story doesn't have to start with support to end with success. It just has to start with belief in you. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been the forgotten one in your family? Or have you had to build something from nothing just to prove you could? Share your story in the comments below. I read every one. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. Because sometimes, one story can remind someone else that they're not alone. Thank you for watching, my friends. Take care of yourselves, build with heart, and I'll see you in the next story.